My name is Kaycee Holland, and the day my fiancé told me he wanted a prenup, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just nodded and said okay. He looked almost disappointed, like he'd been bracing for a fight that never came. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd been waiting for this moment, not because I expected it, but because deep down, I always knew his love came with conditions. And that night, sitting across from him in our favorite Italian restaurant, watching him slide a manila folder toward me like it was a business proposal, I realized something that would change everything. Sometimes the person you're ready to build a life with is actually just building an exit strategy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm 31 years old, and for the last 6 years, I've worked as a veterinary surgeon at Riverside Animal Hospital in Portland, Oregon. It's not glamorous work. Most days I come home smelling like antiseptic and dog fur, my scrub stained with things I'd rather not mention. But I love it. There's something pure about the way animals trust you, how they don't calculate your worth or measure your value against some invisible standard. They just need you, and you show up. I thought that's what love was supposed to be like too. Marcus Chen and I met 4 years ago at a charity fundraiser for the local Humane Society. He was there representing his tech startup, some kind of financial software platform I never fully understood but always nodded along to when he explained it. He wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and when he smiled at me from across the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Seen. He didn't talk down to me when I mentioned my job. He didn't make jokes about crazy cat ladies or ask why I didn't become a real doctor. He just listened, asked questions, and by the end of the night, I had his number saved in my phone under a name I was already starting to imagine saying for the rest of my life. Our relationship moved fast. 3 months in, he asked me to move into his downtown loft, the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick that made me feel like I was living in a magazine spread. 6 months after that, we were talking about forever. A year later, he proposed on a beach in Cannon Beach, the rain coming down in sheets, both of us laughing and soaking wet. The ring was beautiful, a simple platinum band with a princess-cut diamond that caught the gray Pacific light like a promise. I said yes before he even finished asking. But looking back now, I realize I ignored the small cracks that were already forming. The way Marcus would casually mention how much things cost, always making sure I knew the price tag on dinner, on vacations, on the furniture he picked out for our home. The way he'd introduce me to his colleagues as his girlfriend who works with animals, the emphasis always landing just a little too hard on works with, as if he needed to clarify I wasn't just some pretty face he was dragging around. The way he talked about his ex, Rachel, who apparently came from money, old Portland timber money, the kind that bought legacy and status, not just things. I told myself it didn't matter. Marcus loved me for me, not for what I had or where I came from. My family wasn't wealthy. My dad was a high school teacher, my mom a nurse. We lived comfortably but modestly in a ranch house in Beaverton, the kind of place where you knew your neighbors and borrowed sugar when you ran out. I grew up thinking love was about showing up, about being there when things got hard, about choosing someone every single day even when it wasn't easy. I thought Marcus believed that too. I was wrong. The night Marcus brought up the prenup started like any other Thursday. He'd texted me during my lunch break saying he wanted to take me somewhere nice, that we needed to talk about wedding plans. I remember feeling excited, thinking maybe he'd finally agreed to the small garden ceremony I'd been dreaming about instead of the massive hotel ballroom his mother kept pushing for. I changed out of my scrubs into a simple black dress, the one Marcus once said made me look elegant, and met him at Lucia's, this upscale Italian place downtown where they knew him by name. He was already seated when I arrived, a bottle of wine breathing on the table, that folder sitting next to his water glass like an uninvited guest. I should have known then. Marcus only drank expensive wine when he was nervous or celebrating, and he definitely wasn't celebrating. I slid into the booth across from him, and he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The kind of smile people wear when they're about to deliver bad news but want to soften the blow first. We ordered. He made small talk about his day, some investor meeting that went well, a potential partnership brewing. I half listened, my attention drifting to that folder, the way his hand kept gravitating toward it like a magnet. Finally, after the appetizers arrived, he cleared his throat and pulled it closer. "Kaycee," he said, his voice taking on that serious tone he used during business calls. "I need to talk to you about something important." I set down my fork. "Okay," I said slowly. "What's going on?" He opened the folder, and I saw pages of dense legal text, words like assets and dissolution and equitable distribution jumping out at me. "I've been thinking a lot about our future," he continued, not quite meeting my eyes. "About building something stable and protected. My financial advisor suggested, well, he thinks it would be smart if we signed a prenuptial agreement before the wedding." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. For a second, I couldn't process what he was saying. A prenup. He wanted a prenup. "I'm not risking my assets on you," he said, and the casualness of it, the way he said it like he was discussing a stock portfolio, made something inside me go very still. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing my fiancé's face. This was the man who'd promised me forever on a rainy beach. The man who said he loved me exactly as I was. And now he was sitting across from me, essentially saying he needed insurance against our love failing. Against me taking something that was his. I could have screamed. I could have thrown my wine in his face, stormed out, made a scene. But instead, I did something that surprised even me. I nodded. "Okay," I said quietly. "If that's what you need, okay." His eyebrows shot up. "Really?" he asked, and I could hear the disbelief in his voice. He'd been expecting a fight. He'd probably rehearsed his arguments in the mirror, prepared counterpoints to my inevitable tears and protests. "Really?" I repeated, reaching for my water glass to give my shaking hands something to hold. "If protecting your assets is important to you, then we'll do it." He sat back, visibly relieved, and started talking about how reasonable he was being, how this was just smart planning, how it didn't mean he loved me any less. I let his words wash over me without really hearing them because something else was happening in my mind. I was remembering a conversation I'd had with my mother 3 months earlier. She'd asked me, point blank over Sunday brunch, if Marcus made me feel secure. Not financially secure, she'd clarified when I started to answer. Emotionally secure. Like you could lose everything tomorrow and he'd still be there. I'd laughed it off then, told her she was being dramatic. But sitting there in that expensive restaurant, looking at legal documents designed to protect him from me, I finally understood what she'd been asking. Love shouldn't need escape clauses. Marcus was still talking, explaining the terms, how the prenup would protect his startup equity, his investment accounts, the downtown loft he'd bought before we met. Everything he'd built, he kept saying. Everything he'd worked for. As if I was some kind of threat to it. As if marrying me was a business risk that needed mitigation. I wondered when exactly I'd become a liability in his eyes instead of a partner. When had his love turned into a transaction that needed legal protection? The waiter brought our entrees, and I picked at my pasta without tasting it. Marcus seemed lighter now, unburdened, like he'd been carrying this weight for weeks and was finally free of it. He reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you for understanding," he said. "This doesn't change anything between us." I squeezed his hand back and smiled, but inside, I was already beginning to understand that everything had changed. Because the man I thought I was marrying would never have asked me to sign away my worth on paper. And the woman I was becoming wasn't sure she wanted to marry someone who needed her to. I took the prenup home that night and didn't look at it for 3 days. It sat on my kitchen counter like a living thing, breathing accusations into the space between Marcus and me. He didn't push. In fact, he seemed almost cheerful, as if my agreement had lifted some invisible weight off his shoulders. He kissed me goodbye each morning with renewed enthusiasm, texted me sweet messages throughout the day, and came home with takeout from my favorite Thai place. It was like he was celebrating, and I was supposed to celebrate with him. On the 4th day, I finally opened the folder. I sat at my small dining table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I read, and with each page, I felt something inside me harden. The document was 32 pages long. 32 pages outlining exactly how little Marcus thought of me, of us, of what we were building together. Everything he owned before our marriage would remain his. Everything he earned during our marriage would remain his. Any business ventures, investments, or properties acquired during our union would be considered separate property unless explicitly stated otherwise in writing. In the event of divorce, I would receive a modest settlement, the amount increasing incrementally based on years of marriage, maxing out at 5 years. 5 years. As if our love had an expiration date he'd already calculated. But it was page 17 that made me stop breathing. There was a clause about my income, specifically about my veterinary practice. Any financial contributions I made to household expenses would be considered gifts, non-refundable and non-recoverable. Translation: if I paid half the mortgage on his loft, half the utilities, half the groceries, and we divorced, I'd have no claim to any of it. I'd essentially be paying rent to live in my own marriage. I read that section 3 times, each time hoping I'd misunderstood, but the legal language was crystal clear. Marcus had structured this prenup so that I could contribute everything and own nothing. I called my best friend Jenna that afternoon. She was a family law attorney, sharp and no nonsense, the kind of person who told you the truth even when it hurt. I need you to look at something, I said, and she heard the tremor in my voice. Come over now, she replied. Within an hour, I was sitting in her home office, watching her face as she flipped through the pages. Her expression went from neutral to concerned to absolutely furious in the span of 10 minutes. Kaycee, she said finally, setting the document down like it had personally offended her. This isn't a prenup. This is a hostage situation. She walked me through it, section by section, pointing out clauses that made her physically wince. The infidelity clause that only applied to me, not him. The stipulation that any children would primarily reside with him in the event of separation because the marital home was his property. The part where I'd be required to sign away any claim to his business, even though I'd been the one encouraging him through late nights and failed pitches and investor rejections for the last 4 years. This document is designed to protect him from you while extracting maximum benefit from your contributions, Jenna explained, her voice tight with anger. He wants a wife who functions like an employee, someone who adds value to his life without diluting his equity. I felt sick. Is this legal? I asked. Unfortunately, yes, she said. As long as you sign it voluntarily. But Kaycee, and she grabbed my hand, you need to understand what you're signing. This man is telling you that he doesn't trust you. That he sees marriage as a business arrangement where he's the majority shareholder and you're just along for the ride. I wanted to defend him. I wanted to say she was wrong, that Marcus loved me, that this was just his way of being practical. But the words wouldn't come because somewhere deep inside, I knew she was right. I drove home in a daze, the prenup sitting in my passenger seat like a third party in our relationship. When I walked into the loft, Marcus was on the couch, laptop open, barely looking up. Hey babe, he called out. Did you get a chance to read through everything? I stood in the doorway, still holding my keys. I did, I said carefully. He glanced up, smiling. Great. My lawyer said we can sign next week. Get it done before the wedding rush. There was something about the way he said it, so casual, so transactional, that made my next words come out before I could stop them. I want my lawyer to review it first. The smile froze on his face. Your lawyer? He repeated. Why would you need a lawyer? Because it's a legal document, I said, keeping my voice steady. And I want to make sure I understand what I'm agreeing to. Marcus closed his laptop slowly. Kaycee, this is already fair. My attorney spent weeks on this. Getting another lawyer involved is just going to complicate things and cost money we don't need to spend. We don't need to spend, I repeated. Or you don't want to spend? He stood up, and I saw something flicker across his face, something that looked almost like panic. I don't understand why you're being difficult about this. You said you were fine with it. I said I'd look at it, I corrected. And now I'm looking at it. With a lawyer. Like any reasonable person would. His jaw tightened. This is exactly why I wanted the prenup in the first place. The words hit like a slap. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, already defensive. You're being emotional instead of logical. We stood there, 10 feet apart in his expensive loft with the city lights twinkling behind him, and I realized with sudden, painful clarity that I'd been building a future with someone who thought my feelings were a character flaw. Someone who saw my love as a liability that needed legal protection. Someone who wanted a life partner but only if she came with limited warranty and an exit clause. I'm going to stay at my parents' house tonight, I said quietly. Marcus, come on, he started, but I held up my hand. I need space to think, and you need time to consider whether you actually want a marriage or just a favorable contract. I left before he could respond, and as I drove through the dark Portland streets toward Beaverton, toward the modest ranch house where love had never needed lawyers, I felt something strange and unexpected. Relief. My parents didn't ask questions when I showed up at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night with an overnight bag and swollen eyes. My dad simply opened the door wider and said, "Your room's exactly how you left it," and my mom appeared moments later with chamomile tea and the kind of hug that makes you feel 7 years old again in the best possible way. I slept in my childhood bed that night, surrounded by faded posters and books I'd read a dozen times, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up with my jaw clenched. The next morning, I found my parents in the kitchen exactly where they'd always been. Dad reading the newspaper at the table, Mom making pancakes on the old griddle that had been a wedding gift from her grandmother. The normalcy of it, the complete absence of performance or pretense, made my chest ache. They didn't treat breakfast like a production. They just lived it. "Morning, sweetheart," Mom said, sliding a plate in front of me. "Your father made too much coffee again if you want some." I poured myself a cup and sat down, and for a while, we just existed together in comfortable silence. Eventually, Dad folded his newspaper and looked at me over his reading glasses. "You want to talk about it?" "Not really," I admitted. "But I probably should." So I told them everything. About the prenup, about Marcus's lawyer drafting a document that essentially made me a tenant in my own marriage, about how he'd looked at me like I was being unreasonable for wanting my own legal counsel. I told them about the clause that called my contributions gifts, about the infidelity terms that only bound me, about how the whole thing read less like a marriage agreement and more like an employment contract with terrible benefits. My mother's hand tightened around her coffee mug, and I watched her knuckles go white. My father's expression did something I'd rarely seen, it went completely cold. When I finished, neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Dad said in a voice I recognized from when he'd caught me sneaking out at 16, "This boy thinks he can treat my daughter like a depreciating asset?" Mom put her hand on his arm. "Jim, let her finish." But there was steel in her voice too, the kind of quiet fury that was somehow more intimidating than yelling. "Here's what I don't understand," Mom said carefully. "You're a surgeon. You save lives every single day. You make a good living. You're independent, intelligent, and kind. So why does this man think he needs protection from you?" The question hung in the air, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. "Because he has more money?" I offered weakly. "Honey," Dad said, leaning forward. "Your mother and I got married with $200 between us and a used Honda Civic. We've built a good life together. We've put 2 kids through college. We own this house outright. And not once, not for a single second, did I ever think I needed a legal document to protect myself from the woman I loved." Mom nodded. "Marriage is about building something together, not dividing it up before you've even started." I stared down at my pancakes, no longer hungry. "So what do I do?" "You already know," Mom said gently. "You just needed to come home to remember." My phone buzzed. It was Marcus, the 15th text since last night. Each one had progressed from confused to annoyed to almost frantic. This latest one read, "We need to talk about this rationally, you're overreacting." I showed it to my parents. Dad read it and shook his head. Man tells you you're overreacting when you're actually just reacting appropriately. Classic move. Mom squeezed my hand. You don't owe him a quick response, sweetheart. Take the time you need. Figure out what you want, not what he's demanding. I spent the rest of that day in my childhood home, and something strange happened. With distance from Marcus and his downtown loft and his carefully curated life, I started seeing clearly. I remembered the small comments he'd made over the years. The way he'd grimaced when I suggested we split a cheaper bottle of wine at dinner. How he'd casually mentioned that his ex Rachel never wore scrubs in public. The time he'd introduced me to his college friends as his girlfriend who's good with animals, emphasis landing just wrong enough to feel dismissive. The way he always picked the restaurant, the vacation destination, the furniture, as if my preferences were suggestions rather than equal votes. I'd told myself these were minor things, personality quirks, the kind of compromises every relationship required. But sitting in my parents' living room, watching my dad help my mom fold laundry while they debated what to watch on television, I realized what I'd actually been doing. I'd been making myself smaller to fit into Marcus's world. I'd been apologizing for taking up space. And now he wanted me to sign a document that made that diminishment legally binding. My phone rang. Marcus, calling for the 8th time. I stared at his name on the screen, my finger hovering over the answer button, and for the first time since he'd slid that folder across the table, I knew exactly what I needed to say. I met Marcus at the same restaurant where he'd given me the prenup. It felt appropriate somehow, closing the circle in the place where everything had cracked open. He was already there when I arrived, looking exhausted and worried in a way I'd never seen before. He stood when I approached, reaching for my hand, but I slid into the booth without taking it. Kaycee, he started, but I shook my head. Let me talk first, I said. He nodded, and I saw his jaw tighten. I've read the prenup thoroughly, I continued. I had my attorney review it. And I understand exactly what you're asking me to sign. Relief flooded his face. Good, so we can move forward then. No, I said quietly. We can't. His expression shifted. What do you mean? I mean I'm not signing it, I said. And I'm not marrying you. The words came out steady and clear, and I felt something loosen in my chest as I spoke them. Marcus stared at me like I'd started speaking another language. You're breaking up with me over a prenup? Over protecting myself? He asked, his voice rising slightly. I'm breaking up with you because you see me as a risk, I corrected. Because you built a document that treats my love like a liability and my contributions like charity. Because you want a wife who functions like an employee without any of the benefits. He leaned back, shaking his head. This is insane. You're throwing away 4 years over paperwork. I'm walking away from someone who needed paperwork to feel safe loving me, I said. There's a difference. I slid the folder across the table, still unsigned. You'll find someone who fits your requirements, Marcus. Someone who doesn't mind being protected against. But it won't be me. I stood up, and he grabbed my wrist. Kaycee, please. We can negotiate the terms. We can change whatever you want. I gently pulled free. That's the problem, I said softly. You still think this is a negotiation. I walked out of that restaurant and drove straight to the animal hospital. I had an emergency surgery scheduled, a golden retriever who'd eaten something he shouldn't have. As I scrubbed in, focusing on the work that had always made sense to me, I felt lighter than I had in months. 3 weeks later, I moved into a small house in northeast Portland with a yard big enough for the rescue dog I'd been wanting. Marcus texted occasionally at first, trying to explain, to justify, to bargain. Eventually, he stopped. My mother was right that morning in her kitchen. I already knew what I needed to do. I just had to come home to remember that love isn't something you protect yourself from. It's something you build together, without conditions, without exit strategies, without lawyers drawing lines in the sand before you've even begun. And the person who truly loves you won't ask you to sign away your worth to prove it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.